Welcome to the Character Sheet, comicbook.com's official tabletop and fantasy YouTube channel. I am Christian Hoffer, and today I am joined not only by producer Pete making a rare on-camera appearance, but also by a very special guest and like one of the men of the hour, so to speak, because he seems just to be popping up on everything. Mr. Spenser Starke, how are you doing today, Spencer?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, now, so we are recording this literally hours after you made your debut on Candela Obscura. So, before we're not here to talk about Candela Obscura, but we should probably at least like reference it somewhat.
Sure.
So like how did you feel like filming that went? You're like a super veteran DM, so like I'm not worried about like, oh, how was it DMing? But that's got to be a very different type of experience than what you're used to. Like the set.
Yeah. So apologies too if my voice is hoarse. We were watching last night, and it was so great to have a group of people that around me that were excited, and like I was terrified, of course, right? Like just absolutely didn't know what to do with myself. So yeah, I think it's really interesting coming at GMing for a channel with an audience where I'm used to, like, I run a lot of home games. I run a ton of games. I run a game basically every week if I can, and sometimes more than that. And so to then take that same style, and like when I run at home, I don't really do that much prep. I make 3 boxes on a piece of paper and put some words in them and then go. Like that's kind of the way that I tend to structure my sessions, just like an idea of what we could do and then go. And so when I came to doing Candela, I came in to do it for the channel. I had this like instinct to over prep because I was like, I'm going to be in front of so many people, and I've never GM'd in front of this many people before in my life. And everybody's going to be judging me and watching me and wanting to like that whole spiral that you go down. And I was like, I should be doing more prep. And then I had to like stop myself and be like, no, run the game the way that you always run the game. Just do the thing, and then you'll be fine. And so I really like had to reset my mindset to be like, no, just run it the same way that you run any other game that you have run of Candela in the past. And the most important thing is like, just listen to your players, right? The players will give you everything you need. You just like follow what they're doing, follow their actions, and describe the consequences of what they do, and know in the background what's going on, at least in the fiction of the world, right? And we did that. And I think episode 1 is a wild ride, but things only get wilder from here. Episode 2 and 3 are some of the most crazy episodes of actual play I've ever done in my life. It was so much fun to just let them loose. So it's got a little taste yesterday of what Candela was like for us, but it's about to go even further. So
man, what a tease. And speaking of teases,
sure.
Excellent
transition. Look at that.
Perfect segue.
Right into it.
A few months ago, me and you, I guess not even a few months ago, it was literally a month ago.
I was gonna say, yeah. Time's weird. Time's a weird soup.
Yeah, God, it feels like so much longer. You and I sat down to play a game of Daggerheart at Gen Con. And I posted a video about it, kind of talking about my experiences, and we got a ton of questions about it.
Yeah.
And, instead of me, running down and trying to remember it, we had the brilliant idea of going, well, why don't we just have Spencer answer some of these? So
I'm here.
Yeah. And, I love Daggerheart. I had a blast playing it. I can't wait to get my hands on more of it. And I figured we'd just spend like a few minutes kind of like running through some of the questions that have come up since these previews came out, because it wasn't just me that got to play Daggerheart. There were a lot of people at Gen Con who got to play it. Mm-hmm. And I was very surprised about there was a lot of people who had very different experiences with it, which I guess that's the joy of tabletop games.
Of course.
Is that you can have such wildly different experiences. And one of the reasons we have Pete on today, for those regular viewers, is he's actually been compiling a lot of these questions So I figured we can just run down before we get started. We should make the caveat. Daggerheart is still very much a game in development, right? Like, you know, this thing is not. We don't even have a release date for it, and we're not going to be. And you know, for our viewers, we are basing our questions off of what we experienced at Gen Con and the current build of the game. We're not going to be trying to like cross examine Spencer or try to get deep secrets out of him, or anything like that. We really just want to clarify some of the expectations and some of the rules as they stood a month ago in the game.
Well, and one of the things I'll say too is that, like, as you know, I tend to work in phases, right? I work in sprints. So it's like we sprint and make a playable version of the game. And that happened a while ago. And then we were like up and running. And then I sort of saw making all like the level 1 stuff. And then it's like, okay, does this work? If this works, then like we build out further, and then we re-examine what we've already made in context of the stage that we're in now, and make sure that works. And so like it's in development, and that means that one, everything here could change by the time we get to publish. Like that's just the way that it goes. And honestly, the stage we're in right now is like we're just playing a whole lot. Like we're just playing and tweaking and playing and tweaking, and if something shows up in 3 months that is not that was working for some time and is no longer working, then we just revisit that, right? Like it's all so fluid right now. So I'm just going to give the idea of what we are doing currently, right? Like where things are at right now. And then I can also talk about like the ways in which we're going about that development, right? Like what are we looking at? Why are we making these decisions? And then like, what are we looking at in the future as far as like ethos of the game?
Yeah, no, and I think this is a really unique opportunity because a lot of the times that we get to talk with the game designers, we're talking about the game as a completed project. We don't get to see the sausage get made, but we're gonna do this thing.
Yeah, I was gonna say part of making games for me is playtesting, and part of playtesting is getting lots of people to play, and that means that we change things. And I truly believe in developing in public. Right? Like I want to know, I want to develop out. I want people to see what we're doing. I want to hear the feedback now. I want to make the choices and know what the repercussions are, or figure out the way that everything fits together in a way that isn't so isolated with just me and like 5 other people, that when it goes to release, it's like, oh, we missed these things. Like the more we develop in public, the more we give people and their eyes on this. It's a game that is for a specific kind of player, right? A specific kind of GM. It's a storytelling focused cinematic game. So like that in and of itself says this is the audience that it's for. So I think that also lets us set expectations around the game where we don't get so far along that people expect it to be the thing that they wanted it to be themselves instead of what we're making, because we can't make a game that's a game for everybody, right? Like you just literally can't. There's no way. So like by being like, this is what we're making, this is what our ethos is, this is what we're trying, like developing in public, we sort of set the expectations of what it is we're doing, and that way nobody's surprised when it comes out.
Well, that's perfect. As a perfect segue, that's one of our very first. We have a couple of generic questions that were asked by a lot of people, and then at the very end we have some very specific ones from specific users we'll start with. But the first one was, will there be a future public playtest of Daggerheart like they've done with Pathfinder or D&D 5e?
Yeah, so right now we're in a private playtest phase. There are talks, about every possibility as far as testing is concerned. I can't confirm anything on my side it's going to be like wide public playtest. But what I will say is that we are trying to get as many people as possible to play it. And there will be opportunities in the future to also continue to test out Daggerheart. I don't know what those look like quite yet in the specifics, but the ethos of what we are approaching this game with is like, we started small, and then we go a little bit wider, and then we go a little bit wider and a little bit wider, right, until we feel like it's ready, and then we release.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And another one, and this is one that Christian, you'll have some insight on as well, is a couple people wanted some clarification on how initiative and turn order worked, because it was a little, I think even in our video we kind of skipped over that part somehow, and in other videos it's been a little bit vague too.
So And correct me if I'm wrong. Part of the reason why I skipped in our initial video was my understanding of it was, there wasn't like a very fixed initiative, like, a turn order, and that it was really fascinating, and it made a lot of sense to me. Like sitting there in the game, and I really liked that play style, and it wasn't as structured as ways past. And I before I just go and like talk over the game designer, the reason why we're talking about it. Yeah. So, but that's the reason we skipped over it, was because it was a little bit more nebulous than like D&D, which has a specific turn order. So, Spencer, can you talk a little bit more about that?
Totally. So one of the things that I really wanted to embody with the game, right, that was forefront of my mind when we went into development, was like, how do I take the cinematic style play, the character focused kind of play that we see that I love to run as we sort of did, Christian, in the game that you and I played together. Like, how do I take that and make it feel like it's accessible? And one of the things that happens in games with initiative that I tend to, is the reason I tend to avoid that kind of combat in my home games, is that when we jump into initiative, we're basically jumping into like a different game, and it transitions us almost in the way I think of it like a JRPG, or like a think like Pokemon, right? We're walking, we're doing the things, we're talking to people, we're walking on the grass, and all of a sudden, there's like a cutscene, and now we're in a battle where we go back and forth and we hit each other back and forth until somebody dies, right? And so that, and I love Pokemon. I play Pokemon, right? Like, I don't mind that kind of style. But when thinking about like, what did I want to do for this game? How did I want to set this apart? How do I want to, bring in that more cinematic kind of flair? Thinking about it, like, and this sounds really dumb, but like, think about like, what is the Skyrim, right? Like, what is the game where you're like, you can run over and hit somebody and then run away and then talk to an NPC and somebody's chasing you, and then you're like, and we're not in this like structured back and forth that basically what it does for all intents and purposes is it locks us into just hitting each other until someone dies. And that is a perfectly fine way to play. My preferred style of running games and playing games is like, I want to know what interesting stuff you want to do here that isn't just necessarily hitting a guy for 20 points of damage every time it comes to your turn. Like, what are we seeing in the scene? And so by not having an initiative, by allowing that, allowing the way that the players and the GM interact be a little more organic, and I'll talk about how we do that in just a second. My hope for what it does is it allows us to think about each moment as like the moment of a scene, right? Like what is the thing that's happening here in the story that we're telling, and then we can make the choices that we make reflect that in the moment. And so what that means is that as the GM, I'm having you make a roll. You make a strength roll to hit with your weapon. You succeed on that roll. So the way that it works, you roll 2d12, you add those numbers together, you add any modifiers that you have as well. And then you're trying to beat the target number, and then you're also looking at the hope and the fear die to see which one rolled higher. So let's say I got an 18 with hope, so that an 18 with fear, so that succeeds, but it comes at a consequence, right? Then you would get to roll your damage. You get to like hit the whatever the creature is that you're trying to hit, and then because it's with fear, play would pass to me and as the GM, and then I would make a move. Now I could, if I wanted to, I have a list of options as the GM of what I want to do, or I can go outside that list. But I have like essentially what are called GM moves, and a lot of this is not coming from like, this is not a lot of the design that inherently like a new design that I'm making. This is all like Forge in the Dark, Power of the Apocalypse, like, it has this history of cinematic kind of gameplay elsewhere. But I have a list of moves that I'm choosing from, and I might choose to hit you in return. So like, yeah, you do 10 points of damage, you do 12 points of damage, but then also in return, you take some damage. You're going to take 8 points in return there. And so I could do that if I wanted to. I also could take any number of other actions. I could, I could introduce a new threat, move a threat in closer to all of you. I could change the scene in some way. I could change the environment. I could have something knocked out of your hand, right? Like whatever the consequence is there, I could also just deal you stress as a consequence, which is something that when I as a GM when I'm like, oh, there isn't like a good thing for me to do here, and I don't have a good twist in the plot. I'm just gonna just take a point of stress as you do this, right? Like this is stressful, and it impacts you in that way. So, I mean, there's lots of options, and basically we lay out like what those options are for the GM, and then say also whatever else in the scene you think would make sense for the story that we're telling, right? So, so that's the way that's approached, and then basically anything besides a success with hope, I as the GM get to make a move. So a miss with hope means you don't get what you want. You take a hope, but then I still get to make a move. A miss with fear means you don't get what you want and things go really badly, right? It's not quite a like critical fail. It's not like you fall and stumble on your blade and stab yourself, right? Like that's not the way that the game is asking us to approach it, but it is saying like, what would happen if something like, what would be the worst case scenario here for you? Like how would what can, you know, something gets cut off permanently, like some sort of situation, some opportunity gets cut off permanently, something very bad in the narrative turns the story in a way we didn't expect. And so by creating that gradient of results, essentially what we're doing is like creating many ways for the story to turn and really taking away the idea that the GM can just plan everything that happens. Right? We're playing to find out what happens. As the GM, I don't even know what's gonna happen next. And by, you know, having this like spread of possible results, we're saying like, listen to the dice, listen to the players, listen to the story. And as you get the results of the dice, like figure out how the story turns for that. And one of the things I've seen too that I'll sort of address is that, you know, people feel like, well, there's the only ways to succeed to really like succeed is to get a success with hope, or to get a critical success. And I think that there's this idea that because you get a success with fear, that is not somehow a success. And the thing I'll say to that is the GM advice, right? The GM's job there is to give you what you want, right? You get what you want, but there is a cost of some kind. There is some sort of complication. And usually that's something that you don't really have control over as a player. Like that's not something that you did necessarily. It's just the way that life works, right? Like you're going to succeed at the thing that you want to do. It is a success. But the scene turns. And that's the part that is for me the most interesting. Like it's that like story thing, right? Where it's like, yeah, you're moving forward, but there's still consequences, there's still complications that are standing in our way. That's what makes a great story, is what we have to face in order to finally succeed at what we want to do. So hopefully that's a little bit of an overview of how we're approaching it. And
no, it makes a lot. It also answers a lot of the next question, which is, and I'll ask it here just so I can timestamp it in the video, which is why the decision to use a 2d12 system? And I think you answered a lot of that with it sets up not only the narrative structure of the game, but the back and forth of combat. It just gives you a lot more options, but I'll let you expand on that more because I feel like you touched on a lot of that in that last answer.
Sure. Yeah. So the 2d12 was me trying to do a couple of things, right? So like with Daggerheart, I want to give people something that they're familiar with, but I also wanted to upend expectations as well, in a way that was like, hey, this is a new way of playing. This is like, you know, the very much take from like the indie world of games where we're approaching things from a cinematic way, we're approaching it from a storytelling way first, right? Like that's primarily our concern. And so in that, the opportunity to have a mixed success, but also the opportunity to like not get what you want, but things don't go that bad, and then not get what you want and things go really bad, indicates to the GM how bad of a consequence to give, right? So it's really giving you like guidance. The dice are giving you guidance on how hard to hit a player with that consequence, which we see with a success, a mixed success, a miss in, though that being the spectrum in like something like Candela Obscura, right? Like that is our spectrum. It's also a critical success, but like that being our spectrum is more simplified, but also for a long-term campaign, like long-term campaign, doesn't give us as many dials, right, to use to be able to use the GM to like judge how I'm going about the story, how I'm using the success or failure of the players to fuel the kind of narrative we're telling. So with this long-term campaign style play, I really wanted to give GMs more knobs to turn in that respect. The other thing with the 2d12 is that 1d20 is 5% all the way across statistically. So the chance you get a 1, chance you get a 20 are the same, which is basically a flat line. I wanted to give a bell curve. I like bell curves in my game. I like when players feel competent at the beginning. And so if we think of like a level 1 character in something like D&D or that kind of system, right? Like in Daggerheart, I wanted you to feel like you were more like a level 3 or so, level 4, right? At level 1. And so the curve on the dice helps to do that. And it makes you more likely to roll in the center of that value, right? You're more likely to roll a 12, 13, 14 than you are to roll a 2 or a 24, which also means that when you roll those higher numbers, that is big and important as well. And your modifiers, because you're mostly rolling around that like 12, 13, 14, like between 10 and 14 is kind of the most common range. But because of that, your modifiers really are the thing that push you over the edge, right? So like if I have a +3, that means a lot in this system. That, where a +3 in a D20 or more like, or even like a D100 system, of course, right? Like 3 doesn't mean as much there, but 3 means more in a 2d12 system because we're more likely to hit the center of that curve. So your modifier is the thing that pushes you over. I think the last thing I'll say too on that is that I was looking at trying to make things easy for players that are used to D20 style systems, because there's no ignoring that we're in the fantasy space, right? And that is predominantly what is in the fantasy space. And so I want to give players and GMs a familiar range to work with. So like you can basically take what a standard difficulty would be in a D20 style game and apply it here. You could shift it up a little bit if you want to make it perfect, but like 10 is the standard for there, 12 to 13 is the standard for Daggerheart. It's not that far off from what you're used to, and you really get the same range of results that you would in a D20 game. It just has that curve. So that was the intention, right? To make it familiar enough, we're saying, it's a 15 to hit, right? Like people know what that means. So giving people that familiar sort of flavor, but then do some really cool, innovative stuff on the back end with the mechanics.
Nice. Go ahead, Christian.
Oh, I was going to say it was really interesting. Like, my day job involves a lot of math, and it was really interesting to see, like, D&D 5e's approach to bounded accuracy. Basically means that your modifiers deliberately never get above a certain point, and that's fine. But it kind of like 5e's way of saying is like, don't give your players magic items or it's going to mess everything up. And the 2d12 system, I feel like it's a much better way of doing bounded accuracy, while making the modifiers feel a lot more important. That it's a really interesting way of tackling, and also the how hits work and damage works. I thought was a really interesting way of doing that as well, because the damage rolls and stuff like that also play, because you're throwing lots of dice and stuff, but it might not, it's like, even crit hits, and I guess that we can talk about that a little bit too.
Sure.
Is that range of damage that it is, where it's like when you roll damage, that's not how much hit points you take. And that's a good thing, in my opinion.
I'm so glad. That was a system that I worked really hard on. So I'm so glad that people are enjoying that so far. Pete, what were you going to say?
Oh, honestly, before we get into credits, I just want to point out, because we inadvertently just answered 2 specific user questions.
Hell yeah.
So Coffee Weapon wanted to know basically the range of the target numbers in a 2d12 system, and how much impact the relatively small attribute values of like the +2 to -1 we saw matter. And we explained that it matters a ton. Like that +2 is super impactful. So that kind of answers his question. And then,
I'll also say that experience too is something that I don't know how much people talked about, but like experience gives you a modifier for a thing that you have experience in, right? And you just get to decide what that thing is at GM discretion. And so like there is the modifiers that you're seeing on the sheet are also augmented by the experience that you have. So really, like, if you see a +2 on the sheet, if you have an experience in a thing, it's really maybe a +3 or +4, right? It's different places that all sort of different places on your sheet that all kind of come together to do that.
Well, that just perfectly answered.
Oh yeah,
sorry, that just perfectly answered Biku Tolu's question, which was, is there anything else involved besides attributes to rolling the d12s? And you just answered that for it.
Experience, yeah, experience basically kind of takes the place of skills. If I have any experience in pirate and I do a thing that's piratey, right? Like, I get to add the modifier from that. It keeps you from having to think. It keeps you from having like 1,000 options of what those skills are in some respect, which you see a lot, in a lot of games. And I love playing games like that. But I wanted to collapse this down to make it so that it's like, hey, if I'm good at doing, if I used to be a pirate, or I am a pirate, right? Like, I would know how to climb a mast. I would know how to swashbuckle. I would know how to do all these things because that's what I do. And so it sort of just like collapses that down into being a single term that lets you add the modifier from that. So that was the approach. The other thing I was going to say too, because I saw questions about this with the 2d12 system, is like, there was the question of like, well, what happens if the GM then rolls and they keep rolling with, whatever it is that they roll with, and then the monsters or the creatures or the enemies keep going. And in Daggerheart, as of right now, the GM doesn't roll to hit. The GM only rolls damage in response to a miss or a mixed success from the players. So like that, it wouldn't occur because as a response to a roll that you made, you might take some damage, right? As something as
the GM is reactionary. He's reactionary versus actionary. Yeah,
exactly. Like as you were sprinting across the battlefield, you rolled with fear. You rolled a success with fear, so you got shot at as you ran by and you got hit, right? Like that's the kind of way that the back and forth happens, and so it also keeps it fast. Right, like I'm not having to roll and then I miss and then you roll and then you miss, and like there's all of this back and forth that happens. It's like, no, I'm just as a GM reacting to what the situation is, and one of the things that I think comes into play there, right, that from a GM side we have to remember is like in any of these systems that we're running, whether it's a D20 system like Pathfinder or D&D, or whether it's like Blades in the Dark, or whether it's a PBTA game or whatever, like we as the GM always have full control over what's happening in some respect. It's like I think it's not we don't. If you want to give an enemy a modifier of +20 so that they just hit somebody every time, like you can do that, right? It's really for you about making sure that the enemies that you're putting forth or the challenges you're putting forth ahead of your players are balanced and are doing the right amount of damage or having the right tactics for the kind of play that and the kind of scene that you're running. And so as a GM, that our whole job is doing that anyways, right? So this is just a slightly different approach to that, to say like in the moment you're deciding what makes sense for the scene, and enemies have like, I had cards, you probably saw them. I had cards. They aren't going to be cards necessarily in the game like that you have to buy. They're going to be like kind of like stat blocks, right, essentially. But I just had cards as reference of like, here's the enemies, here's all the like important information that you need to know. Here's how much damage they do. Here's like what it takes to hit them. Here's what it takes, for them to hit you. Like what's avoiding an attack look like for them? What moves do they have? What kind of tactics do they take? How do they think about the battlefield, right, when they're on it? And all those important bits are in that stat block, as we kind of are calling it. But they don't have actual stats in that respect, like because I'm not rolling, right? So stat block is kind of a holdover, but it's the term that we're using to describe what it is the GM has. So all of that is kind of the way that 2d12 system plays into how damage is done, and how combat flows.
Nice.
Before we move on, one other thing that came up was talking about the player initiative side of it, in which how Daggerheart works is a player technically can go 2 times in a row. If we get a rolls and I roll with hope, I could go again if there is a reason to do so in the course of the story, or somebody else could raise their hand and say, actually, there's a thing that we could do really well here. Yeah. And there's combo moves, right? I'm not misremembering that.
There's combo moves.
Yeah. So, there was a little bit of confusion there. about that, and like that kind of ties into that entire like the cinematic style of battle where you see these sequences. I was watching the live action One Piece yesterday, and
I haven't watched it yet.
It's
shockingly good.
Shockingly good.
Great, I love that.
I had very low expectations for it, and it exceeded it.
I love that.
But it was watching the fight. There was like the fight with it's changed from the manga, but it's against Iron Hand, the first Marine,
Axe Hand Morgan.
Axe Hand Morgan. Thank you. And in that, like Luffy and Zoro or Zora, they team up to fight. And but like a lot of times, it's like Zora's hacking away, and then Luffy comes in with he finds an opening and takes a pot shot and stuff like that. And I actually was thinking about this interview. I'm like, oh, that's how Daggerheart works.
Yeah,
it's like
that's the whole ethos. Is like, how do we make it so that you feel like you can do combo moves? You feel like you can help in any somebody's going to try and hit this thing, and you're like, oh, I want to help. I'm going to spend hope to be able to help here. I'm going to take my rope and try and wrap it around their legs and pull on it. Spend my hope. I'm going to help you. We're going to do this together. We describe the scene, and then we both are contributing to what's happening. The player who's helping rolls their d6, and then the player who's making the roll rolls their standard action roll, and then they get to add the d6 that the player who helped. They get to add that value to the roll, so they feel like really you're both rolling in that moment to like contribute to the way that the game is working. And one of the things I'll say there that is as people come into playtest and people that are used to initiative and are like, we jump into combat, and they're like, well, how does combat work? And my response is like, the way that everything else in the role-playing game that you're used to playing works, right? Like anything outside of combat, they're like, how do we know whose turn it is? I go, how do you know whose turn it is when you're not in combat? You all look around at the table and figure out who should go, right? Like we're used to doing that. We do it anyways. It's just that we've become accustomed to there being, because of D20 systems that use initiative, or any system that uses initiative, we've become accustomed to, there being this break between the two. And so this game just says, what if there is no break? What if there's no difference between the two, and we look around at the table and see who wants to go? And also, I will say, it is part of the GM's job to spotlight. So they go like, great, you did that. We're going to jump over to here and see what you're doing next. And we have tools built into the GM side. Two tools, and I'll be quick with this just so that, but to hit on it, because I think people are wondering, like two tools that are built into this that I think help. They're kind of the same tool, but they're used in two different ways. So basically, I have this like half sheet that has a bunch of circles on it, and I take modifier tokens. So modifier tokens are what the players use to add their modifiers to the roll. They're like, right now we're just using little resin crystals, but I don't know what they'll be in actual production. But yeah, like these little markers, right? And I put the players' names above each of those little circles that are printed out on a half sheet. And then as players act, I can take those modifier tokens and just place them in the circles. And that tells me that they've done a thing. And then if a player has done 4 things when every other player has only done 1, I have a visual representation of what the spotlight has been at the table so far. And so I can go, oh, I probably need to or if one person has 1 or 0 and everybody else has 5, right? I have a visual representation of that to go like, oh, I should put the spotlight on that person more. So that's one on the GM side, one tool that I've used before, especially for GMs who aren't used to that style of play. The other one, and the one that I actually prefer to do, is take that and put it out on the table. And then every time a player takes their action, they just take a modifier token and put it on the circle, and they're like, yeah, I want to do a thing. I'm going to put it out here. And all of a sudden, the table manages themselves. They look down and go, oh, I've done 5 things and nobody else has done anything. I should let other people do things, right? And that way it's not keeping you from doing 2 cool things in a row. If the table's like, yes, of course, scurry up the side of that building and then shoot somebody with an arrow. Like those 2 things are linked. I might have you make an agility roll to get up the building and then like a precision roll to fire the bow or whatever, right? Like those are 2 different rolls, but doesn't mean you can't do both at the same time. Doesn't mean both don't happen in the scene that we're seeing. And it just means that I will then move the spotlight to somebody else. So hopefully that helps clarify like the mindset around that.
No, I think that does. That answers a lot of questions. And we'll take a break from we have a couple big ones to save for the end, but we can speed round a few of these, I'm pretty sure. Cool. One is, and I'll just go through them real fast. One is multiclassing going to be a thing?
Yeah, it is, and it's built into the system already. We're playtesting it. It is part of the like modular sheet design. So currently, the way that it works, you have your character sheet, and then if you multi-class into another class, you actually have like it's like a third of a page or a quarter of a page. I don't remember what the size is, but essentially, it slides in next to your character sheet, and you can get a new foundation for that class as well that you put on that sheet. You get to choose a new domain to go into because of that new class that you've chosen, and so it slides in and essentially like becomes a full spread, and with trying to keep the sheets modular but also keep them contained, like I'm trying to keep real estate in mind as we do that, right?
Yeah.
Like things should slide in and slide out, but they don't need to stay out. Your multi-class sits on the side a little bit, but doesn't take up, isn't like an entirely separate sheet that has to sit off to the side. It's like, no, it slides in, takes up very little real estate on the right-hand side, but like lets you have everything on hand that you need to be part of that class.
Nice. And that leads into one of our other very like most popular asked questions, and that is the plan currently for those cards, domain, foundation, etc., to be included in the rule book? And would future expansions also just come with future new cards? Like, basically they're just wondering if cards will be a separate purchase or not for them.
Cards are built into the system. What I'll also say is that cards are not like everything that's on the cards is going to be in the book. We aren't going to like say like you have to just like if you lose the card you're out of luck, right? Yeah. Like everything is going to be in the book. There's going to be everything available to you to be able to like do whatever you want in that respect. If you're somebody who doesn't want to use the cards, you can literally just get a blank character sheet and write everything into the character sheet. Like, we're not here to stop you from doing that. The cards are just a way to be able to create fast, building of characters and swapping. And also it just feels cool to like have cards on a sheet. I don't know. I love it. I use cards in most of my designs, so that's why. But yeah, they're going to be included. They are part of the design. It's like, it's not designed to be an ancillary product, but also everything will be in the book.
Perfect. Yeah, that answered another question. And then the last of actually there's two. One is, will the game launch with a solo play option? And that's from @Rollcraft.
Right now, like I don't know. We'll see. Like I'm in development.
Yeah, that's what I was just saying. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm in development on like on the core system right now. So anything beyond that, we'll see what happens.
All right, and then the other of the last of the speed round,
sure,
is there going? Well, yeah, I'll throw in one more after this. Okay. Is there a default world for Daggerheart, like how Forgotten Realms isn't for 5e or Galarian is for Pathfinder?
So still in development. What I can say is that the ethos of the game is to say, and Christian, you sort of experienced this. Like the ethos is to say, hey, at the table, like we're going to play collaboratively. Now, what level of collaboration that means is totally up to you as a GM. If you want to prep adventures in Forgotten Realms and play there, if you want to, bring over a campaign you've been playing already in Forgotten Realms, you can do that. If you want to play in a different world that you've homebrewed, you can absolutely do that. There's nothing stopping you from doing that. But it built into the game, there will be like an example. I'll back up. There will be a way to be able to collaboratively build a map of some kind, right? So like one of the ways currently, the way we're playtesting it is there's a blank map and it has a bunch of names at the bottom of places and like some options for names of regions. And we pass that map around at the table during character creation. Everybody fills in on the map cool places. And I ask them as the GM to describe what that place is like. And by the time we get done with that, at the end of character creation, we have an entire region of a place with places that the players care about because they made them. And then I, as a GM, take that back and build the adventure around the characters, backstories and around what they built, the cool stuff that they built. And I, as a GM, will also receive the map. I'll also put something cool that I want on the map and then continue passing it. And it's really incredible. By the time we get done with that process, even going around 2 or 3 times, you have like a fully flushed out place that when I say, oh yeah, we're going to the Saffron Fields, everybody at the table knows exactly what the Saffron Fields are because they were there when they were made. And there was a 2 or 3 sentence description given of it of like, yeah, it's a field, but the field is full of bodies, right? Like the things that are growing there are people. And you're like, okay, that's weird. What's gonna, and so like that's all that I get as a GM from the player, and then I can go and like use that as inspiration to build a cool thing down the line. And there will also be a built-in like version of that in the game upon release. Currently, that's the plan, to say like, hey, if you don't want to do any of this, we're gonna give you a thing to play in. We're gonna give you a sandbox to play in for the beginning. But the ethos of the game is like, even in that, the GM, you should make some choices about what's important to you and what's important to your players here, and how does that impact the world that you're all playing in.
Perfect, because that answers. I'll put aside the last speed round question, because that goes right into the most asked question. Because I think a lot of people had some fears that, based on the initial reports, initial playthroughs, that characters would have almost all the agency of like world building and like narrative structure instead of the GM. Where this is much more like the GM is still the world builder, the GM is still the one telling the story. The characters have as much input as they and the GM would like, in terms of, there's just a format there to let them pitch in a bit. It's not like they're not making the world themselves and just handing it to the GM and being like, here's the world now, we're going to do this story. And the GM's like, okay.
Yeah, no, absolutely not. Yeah, you can prep as much as you want as a GM. You could do a traditional, adventure in that way if you'd like. There's nothing that's keeping you from doing that. The ethos of the game, the way that I'm approaching it, is very much like, hey, GM, do some prep. Use what your players have given you to like tie in their stories to the prep, right? So if they're like, yeah, I have this person chasing me down, and I accidentally like, stole something from them, and they've been chasing something important, and they've been chasing me down ever since then. Use that, like take that, and then like have that person show up when they're at a place when they least expect it, right? Like just that basic kind of incorporation of player backstory. And I think part of that, to be honest, part of the what's the right word? The way that people misconstrue that is like, I run games really collaboratively. Mm-hmm. So when I'm there and I'm like, and Christian, I remember in our game, I'm pretty sure it was our game, where I was like, yeah, we named the kind of guards or enemies that we were up against. And then I was like, Christian, what kind of armor are they wearing? Like what sets them apart from, how do you know that they belong to this group that you all have, the Horde, I think is what it was. How do you know they belong to the Horde? And you're like, oh, they have this awesome beetle armor that, is shiny. And I was like, rad as hell. Okay, cool. We're doing armor. We're doing beetle armor people. I love that. And then that became what the truth was. But that was only because I, as the GM, wanted your input on a thing that you had made previously. I could have very well been like describing what that thing was on my own if I wanted to. It's also because I was running a one shot where we were just like having fun, right? Yeah. So, like I was just throwing things around. And again, I love that style of play. That's how I play. The game will encourage you to like be collaborative with your players, but at the end of the day, you run the game you want to run.
Yeah, it seems like if the DM and the party want to run a pretty on the rails game, they can do that, absolutely. And even then, they will still have the collaboration of like when combat occurs, because that's very back and forth reactionary. So I think that just answers a lot of people's fears, for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
Like it is as on the rails or off the rails as you would like it to be as a group.
And we give you guidance in doing the author, or in doing the like collaborative kind of play if you want to do it, because I know it's new. But yeah, and so you aren't just like left out to dry there, right? But like you can run it however you want.
I looked at it that style as it was just an extension of when I sit down, when I get ready to like start a new game with a new group of people, I ask like, what type of game do you want to play? Like within the D20 systems, there are so many different styles. Do you want to do a mystery? Do you want to do a dungeon crawl? Like, what do you want to do? And then I respond to that and build whatever my campaign ideas and incorporate that campaign ideas into the style of game that they want to play. What we did was basically the same sort of thing, just taken to its next natural step.
Yeah, and also like we weren't sitting down to play a campaign, so it was like in the moment, I was asking you essentially what interested you, right? Like it's just like, instead of doing it at the top of the campaign, I was doing it as we were playing. And I tend to do that. Like, that's just the way I run games, even in the middle of a campaign. But like, you don't have to. You run the game the way you want, right? Like, you'll see even if you watch Candela last night, for anybody that watched Candela, like, I was turning to players and asking them stuff. I was, having their backstories really were the fuel for the entire adventure we're on. Like, that's just my style. So
nice. All right, and I know we've got a few. We'll speed run these last bits because I don't think
I have time. If you all, I don't know if you all.
Oh no, we have time. We just didn't want to. Take up your entire day.
I have time. So yeah, we don't need to rush.
Where?
I'm here.
Okay, well, there's two here. There's at least one more that has a pretty easy, relatively short answer, and that is another one that got asked a lot, mainly due to all the artwork out of Daggerheart we saw at Gen Con, and that is, are all Ancestries anthropomorphic, or will there potentially be fantasy races or humans available down the line? We've seen some of that in the artwork. We've seen some humans in the artwork, but people were just curious if they would have the chance to play an Ancestry that's like not just anthropomorphic, but also like something more classically fantasy based.
Dwarves, elves, things like that. Yeah.
Totally. There will be what you expect. You'll be able to play what you expect to be able to play, and then the stuff that we showcased was like, what cool stuff is different from that? Like how is that different from what you? The ones that we chose were like some of what you would expect, and then some new ones. And the thing I'll say about Ancestries is that we have a bunch of I made a bunch of them, and I don't know which ones are going to make it to final publishing. So we're playtesting them all to see what's fun, right? And I just want to hone in on what's fun. And then if there's stuff that we feel like works better for an expansion or something down the road, if that ends up becoming a thing, like, in Success, we would have more Ancestries that come out. And so, yeah, I mean, you're going to get what you expect out of a fantasy system. And then I'm hoping to give you additional options of fun things that take you outside of maybe what you would expect as well.
And then, another one that's got a pretty cut and dry answer that we touched on really briefly in our video, but I think could get fleshed out a little bit, is what happens when your stress gets maxed out? Because there are some classes that use stress, but they weren't quite sure what happens for all those other classes that don't, or even the ones that do, once that stress hits its max.
Yeah, so stress is a currency that can be used by the player, by the character, but by the player to be able to trigger some abilities. So you might mark stress to be able to do that. You're never spending stress, which was a question I was seeing some people talk about. Like, what happens if I take stress and then I spend stress to be able to do abilities? It's not a give and take like that. If you're marking stress because you're taking damage, you would also be taking stress to be able to do an ability. So there's going to reach a point where, like you said, you're going to run out of stress to be taken. Currently in the design, the way that it works is that if you are full up on stress, you can't do any abilities or spells or anything that would require you to take stress to do that, right? So like, you're basically out of luck. You're, for all intents and purposes, you're out of that spell slot, to use a D&D term, right? Like you just don't have the ability to do that thing anymore. But if you ever take damage and that damage is below your minor threshold, and you should take stress because of that, instead you just mark a hit point. So it just starts to roll over.
Gotcha.
Right. So you're just at that point, you're like so stressed that you no longer, it no longer like glances off of you. You are taking hit points.
Gotcha.
And then the other thing I'll say about stress too is that stress is in particular a way for the GM to be able to give consequence in verbal, not altercations, but like anything that would be stressful for them verbally or situationally. If like you're trying to sneak by a guard and you roll a success with fear, right? You're going to succeed at sneaking by them, but it's going to be stressful for you to do that. Yeah. So you might mark a stress to do that. So it's a currency that also allows us to do things that aren't just straight up like body damage, right? Like, I'm not just taking damage for doing anything, but it does lead to you not being able to kind of avoid those smaller bits of damage in the future because you're just too overwhelmed.
This is the game for millennials. As a generation, we are all too familiar with the.
No, we all come in with max stress.
Yeah, with the toll that stress can play in our lives, and by God, we've mechanized it for this game.
One of the things that I'll add too is that you have the ability over the course of your campaign to increase how many stress slots you have. You have the ability to be able to, increase how many hit point slots you have. And so because of that, some characters will use stress more than others. They'll use stress to activate abilities or things. And so because of that, I want you to be able to like customize who your character is. If you take a lot of stress, you might be used to taking a lot of stress. So on that level up, you take an extra stress slot, right? So
cool. Well, then we just got two. I know Christian has to run. We have two quick questions, and I think we'll get through there. The first one is just, will there be a mechanical benefit to sharing or synergizing your party's domains if you have multiple people that kind of overlap the same domains to kind of offset the fact that they're now having to share a card pool? Or is that just sort of a way of getting them to do character variety?
It's really character variety, and there are fun interplays between cards. Everything's still in playtest, so like maybe the answer is maybe. But it's an awful answer, but like maybe. The main thing is that you'll have access to all the cards in your domain, right? Like if there's a desire for the GM to limit that so that players aren't taking the exact same thing if they share domains, you can do that. If you want to have 3 people that have, wall walk, like go for it, right? Like that's really up to you and the players at the table. And we're still playtesting sort of what the guidance is in the book around like, are you limited? Like, does the book rules as written recommend you only have one set of those cards at your table? Is the rules as written that you can have as many as you want and just write down the ability if you don't get the card? Like, what is that? Or is it getting another, deck of cards? Like, whatever it is. Or do you have a PDF of print and play stuff and you can print it out and take another one, right? Like, all these things are on the table. We're trying to find how the system works best.
Perfect. And then I think the last thing we have, and I think it's a fairly simple one, and we got asked it a lot for some reason, mainly because I don't think Christian was playing a spellcaster in the demo, is how does magic work?
Yeah. So magic works significantly different from what you might be used to in a D20 style system. Mainly you do have a spellcast ability. So you might have or you will have, if you're playing a character that does magic, you have an ability that you use to cast magic. But every class also has weapons that do magic damage. So like, or if you do magic, if you have spellcast ability, you can take a magic weapon. And so as a wizard, like you have a staff, and that staff can shoot far range, and you can just do straight up damage. Like if you just want to make an attack with a wand and you're far away, you can do that. Like you have the ability to just cast a spell there. Now there are specialized spells as well, and those come from the domain decks and a couple of other sources, the starting moves you have on your sheet. And so you'll have you'll choose what kind of spells you want to have as your character, and then they will have language telling you what you can do with them, what you can't. Some spells you can just do. Some spells you spend hope and a thing happens, right? Some spells you mark stress and roll with spellcast because it is particularly powerful, and so you're taking a thing before. Sometimes you might, sometimes you might roll with spellcast, and then if you get hope on that roll, then an additional bonus thing happens, right? So, and then some things are cast once per short rest, once per long rest if they're particularly big and bold. You might have that. You might have the caveat. And as a player, you get to make the choice. Okay, I know I'm taking this spell, and I know that means I can only cast it once per short rest, but it is powerful when I do. So I'm going to take that as my option. Or you have the option of spells that don't do that, where you can cast them more often. So like really, it'll tell you on the card what the limitations are. It'll tell you the distance. It'll tell you all these things so that you can make sure you're informed when you're taking that spell, what it is you're doing, like what you want your character to do and how that is going to impact your play. But really, it works like moves, like any other move, any other ability that a character would have. There's not like spell slots. There's no like limitation to that unless the card specifically says it.
All right, well, perfect. Wanted to run a little low on time because I'll let Christian finish up here. I know there's a target around him, got a Lorcana restock. He's got to get out the door.
I wish. No, I was just going to say the spellcasting, because I was playing as a rogue, but I did have a couple of like spell-like abilities.
Yeah,
and it felt to me more like the spellcasting system of something like like Elden Ring, as opposed to Dungeons and Dragons, where it's like, you know, like you might have a wider range of spells that you can choose from, but ultimately, you know, you have a limited amount of number of active things that you're doing. You know, because you only have 2 hands or something like that.
Right. When you have those 5, you have those 5 in your loadout by the time you get there. And then one of the things I'll say, because I saw people talking about it, is like you also have a vault where all of your other cards are stored, and you can spend stress to be able to bring one of those cards into your loadout. So if you're like, oh my God, I have the perfect spell, but I didn't prepare it. You're like, I could spend 2 stress on that card and flip it in and be able to do the thing that I wanted, but I need the 2 stress to do it. So I'm going to do it now, because if I don't do it now, I might not have that stress later. So there's the option, you know, of being able to flip in cards into your loadout as desired, and you shouldn't ever be without something. You just might have to make a sacrifice to get what you want there.
No, I like that. As a D&D player who often plays a spellcasting class, there's nothing worse than being like, oh, I forgot how to cast Lightning Bolt today. I hope maybe I'll remember tomorrow, but I just forgot today. It left my brain. It's gone.
I don't have the right book.
Yeah, I left the book. Oh, I took the one book back, and I grabbed the other books on hold at the library.
So last question.
Sure.
We always like to kind of like turn it back to the person being interviewed for the last question. Is there anything that we missed about Daggerheart that you want to get out before we let you go?
It's so nice. You know, there's so much about the system that I think doesn't come into clarity until you just sit down and play it. Right? Like, I think there's a lot of speculation around, like, how do these systems work, and how's the 2D12, the hope and fear feels like it is punishing, or what, you know, all these things. And like, what I'll say is, we're playtesting it all the time. We want it to feel good. We want it to, like, you know, we want it to flow well. Our whole job is to make a game that people love, and we're gonna be playtesting for a very long time to do that. And so, like, I think a lot of this will come down to, like, you get it at your table, you play it. Does it work for you? Is it the style of game that you want to play? And if it isn't, that's okay. There's so many cool games for people to play. And our game specifically is like cinematic, story focused, right? It's supposed to feel like it is collaborative, supposed to feel like it's not GM versus the player. It's like all of us are there telling a story together, and we're using mechanics so that none of us know what happens next. And so really just trying to use that ethos to guide us in the decisions we're making. And that will drive some people to love the system and use it. And it will drive some people to go like, oh, I would prefer a more absolutely crazy, you know, like crunchy system, a GURP system, or, you know, or a Pathfinder where it's like on the other side of the crunch spectrum. And I play all those games. I love all those games. This game is specifically designed to do this kind of play.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that you know, thank you very much for, you know, spending a lot of time, people, you know, clarifying a lot of this. I think this is a lot of good information. You know, I'm really excited to see the next steps for Daggerheart. So, you know, we're looking forward to it. Like, Daggerheart has been, you know, really fun to cover. It was a blast to play, and I can't wait to see what happens next.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate both of you sitting down for so long and talking about it. And I'm here. We're going to be playing for a very long time. So if you ever have more questions when things come along, you know, I'm sure we'll chat again.
Okay. Well, and on that note, you know, be sure to like and subscribe this video. You know, we will have lots more Daggerheart coverage, you know, as more news about it comes out. So, you know, stay tuned to the character sheet. And until next time, thank you very much for watching.
For every like and subscribe, he will add 1 classic fantasy race into Daggerheart.
That's a promise.